Deep beneath the floor of the South Pacific Ocean, buried under layer after layer of sediment that had been quietly settling for millions upon millions of years, researchers found something that genuinely stunned the entire scientific community when it was first announced. A discovery so unexpected that even seasoned researchers reportedly needed time to fully process what they were looking at. Tiny microscopic living organisms, bacteria that had been sitting quietly in complete darkness, cut off from sunlight, cut off from any meaningful source of food for over 100 million years, a length of time so vast it stretches back well before humans, or anything resembling humans, ever existed anywhere on Earth. And when researchers brought samples of this ancient sediment back to their laboratory, gently gave these ancient microbes a little bit of food and oxygen, something remarkable happened. Something that would go on to challenge basic assumptions about how long life itself can actually persist under the harshest conditions our planet has to offer. They woke up, they began moving, they began reproducing, just as though barely any time had passed at all. A result so striking that it genuinely took the research team some time to fully process what their own data was showing them. Let's slow down and walk through this discovery carefully, piece by piece, because it's one of those genuinely rare moments in science where the actual result was even more remarkable than what researchers were originally expecting to find, which is exactly the kind of story worth taking the time to fully understand. This story begins in a region of the ocean researchers call the South Pacific Gyre, an enormous stretch of open ocean located in one of the most remote parts of the entire planet, far from any shipping lane or major research station most people would ever think to visit. This particular patch of ocean is sometimes described as one of the most lifeless regions of open water anywhere on Earth, since it sits so far away from any coastline or major source of nutrients that very little organic material ever drifts down from the surface waters above. Researchers sometimes refer to this kind of extremely nutrient-poor ocean region as an oceanic desert, since so little life is able to survive there compared to richer, more productive parts of the world's oceans, making it exactly the kind of place scientists might reasonably expect to find little to nothing living at all, let alone something ancient enough to predate most dinosaur species. In 2010, a team of researchers aboard a specialized deep-sea drilling ship traveled to this remote region and drilled down through the seafloor itself, extracting long cylindrical samples of sediment from far beneath the ocean floor, in water depths reaching close to 6,000 meters, nearly 4 miles down, a depth that alone represents a genuinely serious technical undertaking. These samples, called sediment cores, captured thin, undisturbed layers of mud and clay that had been slowly accumulating on the ocean floor for an almost unimaginably long stretch of time, with the very deepest, oldest layers dating back over 100 million years, to a period in Earth's history when dinosaurs still walked the land above, long before any human being would ever exist to wonder what might be buried quietly beneath the waves. It's worth understanding a little more about the ship and the technique used to collect these remarkable samples, since the process itself represents a genuinely impressive feat of engineering. The vessel involved, part of an international scientific ocean drilling program, is specially designed to lower a drill string thousands of meters down through open ocean water and then continue drilling further still, down through the layers of the seafloor itself, extracting a continuous, undisturbed core of sediment as it goes, keeping a drill steady and precisely positioned while operating in open ocean, sometimes in choppy or unpredictable weather conditions, while drilling down through nearly 4 miles of water before even reaching the seafloor, represents an extraordinarily difficult engineering challenge, one that took decades of refinement in deep-sea drilling technology to make possible at all. Every single sediment core, collected this way, represents a genuinely significant scientific and engineering achievement in its own right, well before any biological analysis of the sample even begins. If you find it fascinating that researchers can drill down through miles of ocean water and then further down through the seafloor itself, pulling up a physical sample of mud that's genuinely older than most dinosaur fossils, that's exactly the kind of remarkable scientific effort this discovery required. Before we continue, if you're enjoying learning about these hidden pockets of ancient history buried beneath our feet, or in this case, beneath the ocean, please consider hitting that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you stories exactly like this one. For years after these sediment samples were first collected, they sat carefully preserved in cold storage, available for researchers to study using whatever new scientific techniques and questions happened to come along. In 2020, a team of researchers decided to test something genuinely bold. They wanted to know whether any of the microscopic bacteria buried within these ancient sediment layers might, against all reasonable expectation, still be alive. This is a genuinely astonishing question to even ask seriously, and it's worth understanding why. These bacteria had been buried under increasing layers of sediment for tens of millions of years, sealed away from sunlight. entirely, and living in an environment with only the barest possible trace of oxygen and nutrients slowly filtering down from far above. Under these kinds of conditions, most forms of life, as we typically understand life to work, would have died long, long ago. And yet, when researchers carefully extracted samples from these ancient sediment layers and placed them into laboratory containers, gently supplying a small amount of nutrients and oxygen, they noticed something happening that nobody could have confidently predicted beforehand. The ancient bacteria began to stir. If uncovering just how far life can genuinely stretch the definition of what's possible fascinates you, make sure you're subscribed, because these kinds of astonishing biological discoveries keep quietly rewriting what we thought we understood about the limits of living things. Let's talk about exactly what researchers observed once they gave these ancient microbes a chance to respond. Using specialized techniques that allow scientists to track whether individual bacterial cells are actively taking in nutrients, researchers found that a remarkably high percentage of the microbes recovered from these 100-million-year-old sediment samples successfully woke up, began consuming the nutrients provided to them, and eventually began reproducing, dividing into new bacterial cells the same way any healthy, ordinary bacteria would. Some of these ancient microbial populations grew by many times their original starting numbers within just a matter of weeks after being given proper nutrients. A genuinely remarkable recovery for organisms that had spent longer in complete dormancy than most entire species have existed on our planet. It's worth explaining a bit more about exactly how researchers confirmed these ancient microbes were genuinely responding to the nutrients provided, rather than simply assuming it based on general activity in the sample as a whole. Researchers used a clever technique involving specially labeled nutrients, versions of basic nutrients like nitrogen and carbon, that had been chemically marked in a way that could later be tracked using sensitive laboratory instruments. By feeding the ancient sediment samples this specially labeled food, and then checking, cell by cell, which individual microbes had actually taken in and incorporated these marked nutrients into their own cellular structures, researchers could confirm with real precision exactly which specific cells were still biologically active, rather than relying on a more general, less precise measurement of the sample as a whole. This careful, cell-by-cell approach is part of why researchers felt genuinely confident reporting such a striking result, since the evidence didn't rely on any single ambiguous measurement, but on detailed, individually verified activity happening inside specific ancient cells. This naturally raises an obvious and fascinating question. How can any living organism possibly survive in any meaningful sense for 100 million years without dying? The answer researchers have proposed involves an extraordinarily slow, almost unimaginably minimal form of existence, sometimes described as a kind of extreme biological hibernation. Rather than actively growing, reproducing, and consuming energy at anything resembling a normal rate, these deeply buried microbes appear to have shifted into an extraordinarily slow, energy-conserving state, using barely any energy at all, just enough to maintain the basic integrity of their cells and repair any accumulated molecular damage, without any of the normal growth or reproduction we typically associate with living organisms. Researchers studying this phenomenon describe it as existing in a kind of extreme slow motion, metabolizing energy at rates so far below what we typically observe in living organisms that some scientists have described these ancient sediment microbes as existing closer to a kind of suspended animation than to ordinary biological life as most of us picture it. This isn't quite the same thing as a bacteria simply going dormant for a short period. The way some bacteria form tough, resistant spores capable of surviving harsh conditions for months or years at a time. This appears to represent an active, ongoing, if almost unimaginably slow form of life, quietly persisting for a length of time, genuinely difficult for any of us to fully wrap our minds around. This distinction between ordinary bacterial dormancy and what researchers observed here is genuinely important and worth spelling out clearly. Many types of bacteria are already well known for forming tough, protective spores when conditions turn unfavorable, essentially shutting down almost all biological activity and wrapping themselves in a hardened protective coating capable of withstanding heat, cold, radiation, and lack of water for extended periods. Some spores formed this way have been documented surviving for thousands of years, and in a few genuinely disputed cases, researchers have even claimed to revive spores potentially tens of millions of years old, trapped inside ancient salt crystals or preserved amber. What made the South Pacific gyre discovery genuinely different, and part of why it generated so much scientific interest, is that many of the microbes involved didn't appear to be relying on this kind of specialized, heavily armored spore state at all. Instead, they appeared to represent ordinary, unprotected bacterial cells that had simply slowed their metabolism down to an almost unimaginably minimal level, surviving through sheer, extreme energy conservation, rather. than through any specialized protective structure built specifically for long-term survival. It's worth pausing to really appreciate the scale of time being discussed here, since numbers this large can be difficult to hold on to meaningfully. 100 million years ago, dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex's ancestors were still roaming the Earth, and the very first flowering plants were only just beginning to spread across the planet. The entire span of recorded human history, every civilization, every written language, every technology humans have ever developed, fits into an almost impossibly tiny fraction of the total time these particular microbes appear to have spent quietly persisting beneath the ocean floor. There's an additional detail worth understanding about the specific conditions these microbes were surviving in, since it adds another genuinely surprising layer to the story. Researchers studying the sediment cores found that oxygen had actually managed to penetrate all the way down through the sediment layers, even at these extreme depths, something that wasn't necessarily expected beforehand. This happened because the South Pacific Gyre region has such an extraordinarily slow rate of sediment accumulation, with new material settling on the seafloor at an almost imperceptibly slow pace. That oxygen from the overlying seawater had enough time to gradually diffuse downward through the sediment, rather than being used up quickly, the way it typically would be in faster accumulating, more biologically active sediment found elsewhere in the ocean. This slow, oxygen-permeated environment appears to have been exactly what allowed these particular microbes to persist in this minimal, low-energy state for so long, rather than needing to rely on entirely oxygen-free survival strategies the way some other deep sediment microbes elsewhere in the world's oceans are known to use. This discovery matters enormously for how scientists think about the fundamental limits of life itself, and not just for understanding ancient ocean sediment specifically. If life can genuinely persist in this kind of extreme, energy-starved, almost motionless state for stretches of time this long, it meaningfully expands what researchers consider possible when searching for life in other similarly extreme environments, including environments considerably harsher than anything found here on Earth. This connects directly to an area of research that might initially seem completely unrelated: the search for life on other planets and moons throughout our solar system. Places like Mars, or icy moons such as Europa and Enceladus, orbiting Jupiter and Saturn respectively, are considered some of the most promising locations scientists currently know of for potentially harboring some form of life beyond Earth, specifically because they may contain similarly extreme, nutrient-poor, energy-starved environments buried beneath ice or rock, cut off from sunlight in much the same way these Pacific Ocean sediment layers are. If life on Earth can genuinely persist for 100 million years in this kind of harsh, isolated condition, it becomes considerably more reasonable to imagine that some equivalent form of extremely slow, dormant life might exist, or might once have existed, in similarly harsh conditions found elsewhere in our solar system. It's important to be careful and precise about exactly what this discovery does and doesn't tell us, since it would be easy to stretch this finding further than the evidence itself actually supports. This research doesn't prove that life exists anywhere beyond Earth. What it does provide is a genuinely important expansion of what scientists understand to be biologically possible, demonstrating decisively that complete dormancy across a 100 million year stretch of time isn't simply theoretical speculation, but something we now have direct, laboratory-confirmed evidence actually occurred right here on our own planet in ordinary bacteria that researchers were able to study directly. There's also something worth understanding about exactly how confident researchers can be that these microbes genuinely represent 100-million-year-old organisms, rather than more recent bacteria that somehow contaminated the samples after they were collected. Take considerable care during this kind of deep sediment sampling, specifically to avoid contamination, using specialized drilling equipment designed to prevent outside bacteria from entering the sample, and testing the chemical composition of the surrounding sediment layers to confirm they genuinely represent an undisturbed, continuously sealed environment, stretching back the full length of time being claimed. The careful, cautious way this particular research was conducted and reported gave the wider scientific community real confidence that these results reflect a genuine scientific discovery, rather than an error introduced somewhere during the sample collection or laboratory testing process. There's one more genuinely intriguing angle worth mentioning before we wrap up, one that connects this ancient ocean discovery to a field of research that might initially seem completely unrelated: the study of aging and cellular longevity. Researchers studying how these ancient microbes managed to preserve their basic cellular machinery across such an enormous stretch of time are interested in understanding exactly what molecular repair processes allowed these cells to avoid the kind of accumulated damage that typically limits the lifespan of cells in more actively living organisms, including our own. While nobody is suggesting this research will lead anywhere near human applications anytime soon, understanding the basic biological Mechanisms that allow a cell to preserve its essential functions across such an extraordinarily long period does offer a genuinely interesting new angle for researchers broadly interested in the biology of cellular aging and long-term cellular preservation, an area of science with implications reaching well beyond ocean sediment specifically. There's something genuinely humbling worth sitting with here, a reminder of just how differently life can behave compared to our everyday assumptions about how living things are supposed to work. Most of us naturally think of living organisms as things that are constantly active, growing, moving, and changing. At least on some noticeable timescale, we can directly observe or relate to. These ancient sediment bacteria challenge that assumption in a genuinely profound way, existing instead in an almost frozen, barely perceptible state, patiently waiting, in a sense, for conditions that might never actually arrive, since these particular microbes would have remained buried indefinitely if researchers hadn't specifically drilled down and brought samples back up to the surface for testing. This raises a genuinely fascinating question worth considering. How many other pockets of similarly ancient, similarly dormant life might be quietly persisting beneath our feet or beneath the ocean floor in other locations around the world that simply haven't been drilled into and tested yet? Given how remote and difficult to access the South Pacific Gyre specifically is, it's entirely reasonable to imagine that similar pockets of ancient dormant life could exist in other deep, isolated sediment layers scattered across the world's oceans, each one representing its own hidden, patient chapter of biological history, waiting quietly for the right combination of scientific curiosity and technical capability to eventually bring it back into the light, the same way this particular discovery finally did. So the next time you think about how resilient and adaptable life on our planet truly is, it's worth remembering this remarkable story from deep beneath the South Pacific Ocean. Somewhere down there, buried under millions of years of accumulated sediment, tiny bacteria spent an unimaginably long stretch of time existing in an almost motionless state, patiently persisting through an amount of time that dwarfs the entire span of human civilization many times over. And when researchers finally reached down and gave them the smallest possible chance, these ancient, patient organisms simply woke back up and quietly, remarkably, continued on with the business of being alive.